significant distinction between survivor claims under Part B and survivor claims under Part E. Under Part B, the survivors, so the worker's deceased, the survivors include the spouse, the children, the grandchildren. It goes on from there. It's a little more unusual that there be a parent or a grandparent or a grandchild. But in any event, the survivors are those who remain, and under Part B, the survivors are paid because the worker had cancer. So there's no need for the cancer to have contributed to the death of the worker. And also, there's no need for the survivor to be dependent on the worker. The survivors, whether it be the wife, the spouse, the wife, the husband, children, they're being paid because the worker had cancer, and that's all. And their trouble, the trouble that they suffered because the worker had cancer. And so, thus the payment of $150,000. That payment goes entirely to the spouse under Part B. And if the spouse is deceased, then is divided between the children. As simple as that. 3 children, $50,000 each. There is no requirement that the children be in any way dependent on the worker. Under Part E, which is really a federal workers' compensation program, it is necessary that the spouse or the children show, first of all, that the illness or condition contributed to the worker's death, and second, that the spouses are always dependent, but children need to show that they were dependent. And they show that by showing either that they were under 23 and a full-time student, and that's a continuous full-time student from the time they were 18 until the time they were 23. Or they were under 18, so a minor, younger than 18 at the time of the worker's death. The third way that a child can show that he or she was dependent on the worker is if the child is incapable of self-support. Now, incapable of self-support refers to a medical reason, not because the child is not able to get a job. That's not enough. It needs to be some significant debilitating condition that prevents the child from working. And at the time of the worker's death. Now, this can be a relatively temporary situation. If at the time of the worker's death you were in the hospital from a auto accident, you recovered 3 months later, there's nothing wrong with that. That means you were incapable of self-support at the time, or at least that would support a claim for benefits under Part E based on inability to support yourself. So these are big differences between Part B and Part E, and they lead to an enormous amount of confusion. But if you remember that Part B is about cancer, and no matter who you are, you're being paid because someone had cancer, not because they died or they owed you anything or you were dependent on them. Under Part E, you were paid because of your dependence on the worker. Under Part E, a survivor claim is typically $125,000 for the spouse or the children who can prove they were minors in school and under 23 or incapable of self-support. And if the worker, so $125,000 to be divided among the children or paid to the spouse. So if the worker had an additional 10 years of work life prior to reaching Social Security retirement age, an additional $25,000 is paid to the survivors. If the worker had 20 years of work life remaining, then 50,000 additional, an amount of 50,000 in additional compensation is paid to the survivors. So the top amount under Part E for a survivor is $175,000. There's some relatively complicated issues that come up under Part E, where a worker has children who are not the natural, who are not the children of his spouse. Under those circumstances, the spouse receives half of the survivor's compensation, and his children divide the other half of the compensation. And so if he has 2 children from a prior marriage and 2 children from his current wife, all 4 children divide 50% of the compensation, and the current wife receives 50% of the compensation.